ramblers in the wilderness. Yeah, we can't find what we need. We get a little restless from the search and get a little worn down.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Sermon Follow-Up Video. I'm Pastor Dave, the lead pastor here at Faith Christian Fellowship, and we have with us Pastor Kyle, the community's discipleship pastor here at FCF. And Pastor Kyle kicked off a great message and a great sermon series that we're going to be leading into fall called Step Up, and how you can step up into the life of the church, and some things and some ways that you can be a part of what God is doing here at FCF, and some things that you can do to partner yourself with the ministry of God's work in His church. And Pastor Kyle started us off by talking about stepping up into community, and it was a great message, a very powerful, heartfelt, convicting message about how we long and need community in our lives. And I want to start with a question that you defined at the beginning. As you were describing the lives of many people, you said that in essence, probably most people feel discouraged, lonely, of weak faith, and even the word hopeless and helpless. The idea that people feel hopeless. And here's the thing that stuck out in my mind. Those descriptions make sense to me when I consider an unbeliever. That makes perfect sense. Like, unbelievers are discouraged, lonely, weak faith, and hopeless. But as you described it, you found that many Christians would identify themselves in the same way. And the question is, why do you think that is? Why do you think that what would make sense for an unbeliever, I mean, ultimately without Christ, we're hopeless? Why is it that we that have Christ, many of us would describe our lives in that same way?
Yeah, it's funny. I talked to a lot of people afterwards and since then, and no one came up and said, "Hey, I don't ever feel that way." You know,
Yeah.
And we go through seasons, and so sometimes we're better off than others, but we've all gone in through those times, and there's lots of ways to get there. It's not just this one certain route that leads to that kind of hopelessness or weakness, or faith feels weak. But ultimately, we live in a culture that pushes success, and it pushes just a busy schedule ahead of everything else, certainly ahead of relationships. If you think about it, how many relationships do you have that you can say, this person really knows me, or this person, I really know them and trust them. It's smaller and smaller, especially as responsibilities get added on and kids get added on and all those things. So that's part of like why we fall into it. But the reality is we talk a lot about our relationship with Christ, and that's obviously number one. That's the most important thing. Without a relationship with Christ, we really are hopeless. We just can put Band-Aids on it. It doesn't. We're not fixed. We're not saved. We're not helped. We're just coping. But we don't focus enough on the relationships that God calls us to have with each other, and we're called to be in community. And it gets pushed to the wayside. Well, my job is too important, or I've got to do this. And all these things that we replace or we fill our time with, they are important to us. That's why we do it. We don't say, well, I'd rather just stare at the wall. Then we fill our time with things we think are important. And we make excuses for ourselves, and we pat each other on the back and say, how are you doing? Oh, I'm keeping busy. Well, okay, that's the epitome of success, and really that's not it. And then we begin to isolate ourselves. And the real reason it all comes down to, we talked about at the end of the Sermon Sunday, what keeps us from real biblical community that we're called to be a part of, that we're designed for this only to work if we're plugged into that. What keeps us from it is fear. It's fear of being known. It's fear of being vulnerable. It's fear of taking off that mask, and fear of being rejected for who we really are. And so we put on a mask, and we expect others to put on their mask and play the game, and let's keep at that distance. Yeah. And we're just as guilty of it. We're just as guilty of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that stuck out to me as you were preaching and walking through the text of Romans 15, which is what we looked at on Sunday, and I loved, what you had pointed out about this connection between living in community and what Christ did. And I think of Romans 15, verse 3. It says, "For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me." That in some ways, Christ made himself vulnerable and for us, in order for us to make ourselves vulnerable to each other. We're already vulnerable before God, but almost the picture of Christ doing this. And you're right, that's probably one of the reasons why many of us feel, instead of connectedness, we feel discouraged and hopeless. And it very well could be the epidemic as to why people walk away from faith or walk away from the church instead of walking toward connectedness and community biblically. Let me ask you this. One of the things you said is you talked about discouragement, is that a great picture of discouragement is criticism. Can you explain that a little bit deeper? I thought that point was so valid and true. What does that mean?
Yeah, so we usually don't realize we're discouraged, like it sneaks up on us, and then maybe it hits us, and we say, "Oh man, I'm so discouraged." But usually it sneaks up on us because we engage these self-defense mechanisms, and one of them is we become critical, not just of people and of things, and I mean that's part of it, but specifically we become critical of what God is doing or wants to be doing, or when people are saying, "Hey, God's doing this in my life, and God's doing these things." Our discouragement is kind of fighting against that and is telling us that that's not happening, or I don't see that happening in my life, and so almost out of spite, there's this tension within us, and we become critical of what God wants to do in our life, when we don't agree with what he's currently doing, or when we see him doing things in other people's lives, and we say, "Well, that doesn't happen to me, so they're just crazy." We get critical, and we begin to doubt. We stop celebrating the things God's doing in those around us, and that leads to more discouragement and more isolation, and we're turning ourselves away from God and his will. And it just leads to this big mess of things. So if you find yourself, and I have totally been there, find myself just being critical of, if someone says, "Hey, I think God's going to do this great thing," and you're just like, whatever. You believe that he can do it, but you're not seeing it, so you just write it off, and it's definitely a sign of discouragement. And we talked about how, I know when people are real critical towards me, it wears off on me, and I become critical, and then I get angry that I've let them affect me that way, and then it becomes this big mess. And even just preparing this sermon and kind of going through all this, I've realized, the people that have been most critical to me, usually are people that are close to me, because I let them in that far. And I come to realize that they are just going through, or were going through, discouraging times in their life, and it makes me look at it completely differently. And then when I become critical, you can say, "Hey, Kyle, you're just discouraged," and kind of snap me out of it. But we do that, and then another thing we talked about a little bit there is how discouragement is kind of being crippled by apathy.
Yeah, I thought that was a great point. Being discouraged is really being crippled by a life of apathy, by apathetic living.
Yeah, and I can't take credit for that. A friend of mine gave me that definition. It's a good one.
Yeah.
We just get to the point where it's easier not to care. It's easier to just let it be, and then we become crippled by that, and we sit in the situation we're in, and that leads to hopelessness, where we feel the situation we're in is final and fatal. Yeah. And it's a descent that happens over time to where we don't realize it's happening, but it sneaks up on us pretty quick.
Yeah. So to make sure we understand that, I think the way you're drawing the line is discouragement begins to set in, and we begin to look at other people, which, by the way, Romans 15:1 talks about bearing with the weak, and it says not pleasing ourselves. So what we begin to do is stop taking our eyes off of others and put it on ourselves. But it seems to be that line is, I begin to feel some discouragement, so I look around at the people around me and think they don't feel what I feel. And so I begin to be crippled by almost saying, I can't go anywhere, I can't do anything, I can't get out of this. So I get crippled, I can't move, I'm almost numb to it. So I'm watching people continue to live normal lives as we're crippled in discouragement.
And a lot of times what we think is a normal life is a mask that they're wearing.
They're wearing, yeah.
Because they don't want you to know that they feel the way you feel.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening by default is we end up becoming critical, and then what happens is they begin to move, and without even knowing it, we become more and more isolated. And I think that's what you're saying is the line of isolation actually begins with discouragement, where we begin to take our eyes off of our own lives and what God is doing and place them on comparison of others, which leads us to being crippled in apathy, which leads to being critical in spirit, which leads to more loneliness,
Isolation.
discouragement, and isolation. So
More isolation.
the vicious cycle of community is seen in those points. And I think for some of us, we have gone around the cycle so many times that we wonder if there's any hope in relationship.
We begin to think this is normal.
Yeah.
This is this is life, and there's no cure for this. There's no remedy for this. This is how it's supposed to be, and we all just go through and deal with it. And Paul states very clearly here in Romans 15, he paints a picture of community and says this is how you have to do it, because I think Christian or not Christian, our flesh draws us towards a selfishness and the desire to protect ourselves and to put up these walls. That's what our flesh tries to do. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to pour into others. We don't want to put others first. We don't. We don't. And so we end up focusing on ourselves because we want to put ourselves first, and that leads to isolation. So.
Let me ask you that, because I think this relates to the last question here and kind of a loaded question. Can we maybe give a biblical definition, or at least a definition of biblical community? What truly is biblical community as we talk about that? If isolation, loneliness, discouragement, and hopelessness is the result of non-biblical community, what does it look like to have biblical community?
Yeah, that is a loaded question, but it's important. I'll try to define it. It won't be a perfect definition. Books are written on this, but
Yeah.
but I think it's different than just friendship, which we were talking about earlier. It's different than just I need a friend. It's deeper than that. I mean, if you think about, who are we as believers? Well, we're friends. We know each other, but on a spiritual sense, we're family. We're brothers. We're adopted by the same Father, and we're given the same marching orders. We're called into this whole journey together, as God calls us to be in the world and not of it, and be light and salt to it. So real biblical community goes deeper than just this is a friend of mine and we're close. It goes to, the Old Testament talks about iron sharpening iron, and I love that verse because it's not just a nice poetic way to say it. You think about how iron sharpens iron. You have to, when you're sharpening iron with a file, it removes parts of the iron that it's sharpening. It damages, it takes away part of what it is you're trying to sharpen, and it's you can't do that without damaging that thing. You can't do that without doing what will look like harm, what's painful. It'd be painful for you. If you're going to sharpen me, that means you've got to be honest with me. It means we've got to be able to trust each other, and it all comes down into that kind of a vein where, and you can't be sharpened by somebody. You can't if you have a wall up, or if you fear that they just want to hurt me, right? You fight against it and you put up walls. And true biblical community, it trusts in that way. It allows for instruction to come in, but it allows for us to know each other on a level that's deeper than we can know people without. I guess the best way to put it is, I didn't really know what it meant to love until I understood how Christ loved me. I didn't know what friendship really meant until I met somebody who knew me and still accepted me, right? So it's a deeper level. It's very difficult to explain because you just kind of have to do it.
Right.
But that's the reality. It's a trust beyond just I know this guy, and the important thing I think to know is, without it doesn't work. Like we're called to live out our faith. We're called to live it out in the world. We're called to be that salt and light. But we can't be if we're not in biblical community, sharpening each other, building one another up, pouring into, encouraging each other. We are not designed as lone wolves, but our culture tells us we are.
Yeah.
And our culture tells us, especially if you're a man, do it on your own. You got to be able to handle this by yourself. And
Yeah, I'm a self-made man.
right,
Yeah.
and that's not. There's no such thing.
Right.
That's a lie. And when we pursue that, it's dangerous, lonely road.
Yeah, no, and I would add with that, I think it's a great point. I think a lot of people in the church are looking for friendship. To be honest, let's take away the word friendship, because in some ways, what we're looking for is someone who will say I'm great and say I'm good and accept me for who I am. We don't need people. The church is not about accepting me for who I am, not saying we don't accept each other for who we are. The church is about making us what we can't be, which is like Christ. That's the purpose of the church. And I love that image of the file and that iron sharpening iron. It is, Romans 15 tells us it was written as instruction, and it says, through the encouragement of the scriptures, we have hope. So may we live in harmony to do that. And so we're to encourage each other in the scriptures, that iron sharpening iron. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it's painful, but someone who is instructing us and instructing each other, and someone we get to imitate. We get to imitate each other as we become more like Christ. And so I think a lot of people in the church are looking for friendship. They don't find it, so it's forget the church. They don't give me what I need. Instead, we ought to look for biblical community. And as you said, biblical community is a deeper relationship. And I want to remind us, in the Bible, in the times of the book of Acts, these are natural-born enemies who are becoming family. These are Jews and Gentiles who are totally at odds with each other. And so, in some ways, biblical community is where natural-born enemies become in a deep relationship with each other because of the work of Christ. So the common bond is Christ. So now we're stirring each other, we're filing each other, we're encouraging each other to become more like Christ. So I want to encourage you, if you are not in biblical community, find a group, and we talked about that on Sunday, whether it be a Bible track, life track, or faith track, the different tracks that are offered here at FCF where you can get some instruction, but also a home group where you can get connected and you can have some people in your life who aren't just being your friend, they're being a joint heir with Christ. They're being someone who is going to help you become more like Jesus. And if there is friendship, that's it. Because in the end, when we stand before the Lord, it's not going to be who told us we were great. It's going to be who stirred us toward Christ's likeness, who helped us become more like Christ. And I think when we begin to look at relationships that way, it redefines what truly friendship is. It's not just somebody liking me for who I am. It's someone who is willing to not be satisfied where I am today and help me get to where I need to be. And that's biblical community. So great sermon. What a great topic. It is huge. You're hearing some exciting things about how community is being built here at FCF. Pastor Kyle's been working tirelessly on that, and we're excited about what God is doing in that way. Hey, we love you. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed it, and continue to grow in biblical community. We want to be a church of biblical community.
Brother, let me be your shelter.